you ever find yourself scrolling Reddit late at night, only to come across a story that feels too real? A story that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? What would you do if those stories weren't just figments of imagination, but the nightmares of others? Tonight, I'm taking you into the darkest corners of Reddit. These stories are more than just creepy, they're disturbing. You might want to leave a light on for this one. Get ready for the top 3 most disturbing horror stories from Reddit. Are they going to pump this out? Alec asked as he stepped awkwardly into the flooded basement, the water rising to just a little below his knees. I don't know, I said. Aren't they renovating the place? I don't think so, I said. It's just this mural they're after. Well, we're gonna need it dry, Alec grumbled. Can't run electricity down here like this. Gonna need it for the imaging equipment too. Yeah, I agreed. Plus, God knows what's in this water. Some of these tunnels must lead off to the catacombs. You can't be serious, he cried, his flashlight suddenly snapping from one bare stone wall to another. Are there actually bodies down here? It's a church, I said. They buried people here. Not recently, but yeah, it has catacombs. Don't worry, they're not just stacked up like firewood in some room. There's gates and stuff to stop people desecrating them. Alec shone his light at the water lapping around his feet and curled his lip. It was the color of old coffee. I don't know how anyone can expect us to work in these conditions. For the money they're paying, I'd work waist deep in the Thames, I told him. The guy's last painting sold for $7 million. You know how excited the church was when they found out he'd been down here in the 70s. Whatever he put on the walls. They charged him with vandalism then, but now there's money on the line. They want whatever he did restored, packed up and sold. Alec huffed. Where is the damn thing anyway? I stopped momentarily to get my bearings. Down here. I waved him on, and we delved deeper into the basement as I led us through a strange mix of large rooms and awkward tunnels carved directly into the rock, some of which you had to stoop just to fit in. Many of the rooms we passed had old boxes in them. One had furniture draped with once white sheets that were now moldy and stained. Another had an old piano, the lid still up. Thankfully, it wasn't far, a few minutes at most. Once we found the door, we both put our shoulders to it and forced it open. Water must have built up because it came pouring out at waist height and nearly took us both of our feet. Fucking stinks, Alec cried over the roar of water, but I ignored him. Once it was safe, we stepped inside and it was as if our lights grew dimmer and the air colder. A distinct sense that we'd crossed a threshold, a long and empty room where the only sound was water dripping somewhere in the distance. I was about to suggest we'd taken a wrong turn, but then I saw one of the walls had been painted black, and there was something strange about it. It was only when you let your eye linger that you saw the brush strokes, each no thicker than my thumb. They covered every inch of it and caught the dim light of our torches, shimmering with brief flashes of iridescent color that were impossible to focus on. The longer I looked, the more I saw great depths in that work. The texture alone was remarkable, like you were up high and looking down on a vast stretch of unbroken ocean, roiling waves made of slick black water, and the color. The closest comparison is what you see when you close your eyes. The whole thing made my stomach churn, but there was no denying its artistic merit. The kind of thing I could imagine hanging on a wall in the Tate Modern. No wonder the church wanted it restored and transferred out of the basement. But it would be no easy feat, it was huge. I don't feel too good. Alec wobbled momentarily before collapsing. I had to rush, but I managed to catch him before his head went beneath the water. Shit! I hissed as I struggled to hold his weight with my arms beneath his shoulders, panicking. I looked around for somewhere to put him, but the room was empty. If I let him go, he'd flop down and inevitably drown. But he was a big guy, and my arms were already getting tired. I had no hope of making it all the way back to the stairs, but I remembered that room was nearby, the one with the furniture. It'd have to do in a pinch. Struggling to keep him upright, I dragged him slowly through the murky waters. It wasn't easy. While the ground was firm, it was still irregular, and I was walking backwards through knee-high water. My mind fluttered through all the possible outcomes of this situation, and inevitably focused on the worst. He could drown, get an infection. We could get lost. Those tunnels were tight and confusing. I could imagine it so very easily, the fear and panic of going around in circles. rough-hewn stone wrapping in on itself so that every turn takes me back to that place as my arms grow ever more tired. What would I do in that situation? I wondered. Would I let him drown, or would I keep going until I collapsed from exhaustion? And how long would I last? A few hours, a day, maybe more? It was a silly idea, but it got my heart racing. Tried telling myself I had it under control. I had a plan. A good one. Get him upright in one of those old chairs. He'd probably just fainted because of the air down there. Maybe he was more sensitive to it than most. But while I tried to keep my eyes on him, watching for any signs of consciousness, I kept looking up at the tunnel ahead. With each step, the darkness felt heavier, and the lapping of the water grew so loud it seemed to almost hurt my ears. And yet at the same, I could hear my every breath as clear as if I was standing in total silence, without any real reason for it. A cold dread crept over me. I didn't feel alone down there. No matter how hard I tried to dismiss it as a childish feeling, it just kept getting stronger. Each time I looked up, I expected to see something. God only knows what I thought would be waiting for me. But it didn't matter. The mere thought there was something in the dark or lurking beneath the water was enough to make me hurry, even as I kept reminding myself that was a great way to make a mistake. Thank God it wasn't far to the room with the furniture. There was no door, so I simply turned and plodded backwards until I saw a chair that looked good enough. Sure, it was disgusting and green with mold and mildew, but all it had to do was hold his weight. Alec is a good 6 inches taller than me and built heavier too, so by the time I lugged him onto the chair I was exhausted and had to stop and catch my breath, hands on my knees, entire body trembling. I took a few seconds to comfort myself before leaning over him and calling his name. "Alec!" I cried. "Alec!" I gave him a few gentle pats on the face. He seemed to stir, but I couldn't say for sure. "For fuck's sake!" I hissed, hearing just the slightest hint of alarm in my voice and trying to suppress it. "Alec, wake up and let's get the hell out of..." Someone pressed a key on the piano, and everything inside me came to a screeching halt. It was dull and off-key, but there was no mistaking the sound that had come from the nearby room. The thought of there actually being someone else down there made my skin tight and my head ice cold. Took every ounce of willpower I had to stand upright and look towards the doorway. "Mike!" Alec groaned, and I damn near jumped out my skin. "I don't feel well," he muttered while rubbing his face. "It's so dark in here. I think I might be dreaming." As the initial shock left me, I was flooded with relief at no longer being alone in that horrible place. "You fainted," I said with as friendly a laugh as I could manage. "Must be the air down here. We'll need respirators from here on in." "I'm cold," he moaned while pushing himself upright. "I want to go home. Can I go home, please?" "Damn right," I said while taking his elbow and leading him to the exit. I felt a lot safer knowing it wasn't just me facing the darkness, but I still found myself hesitating as we passed the next room along. "What is it?" Alec asked as I paused to look at the old piano. "Nothing," I muttered before hurrying us both along. Someone had closed the lid. "It's like a different painting when photographed." Marie pursed her lips as she looked at the camera display. "Something to do with how it catches the light?" She picked the tripod up and moved it several feet to her right. She pressed a button and the flash went off in the dark room like a bolt of lightning. For an instant the whole place was laid bare, roughly hewn stone and stagnant water. "Look," she called me over. "It happened again." I stopped my work setting up the fourth pump at the far end of the room and wandered over. So far I'd managed to pump out most of the water, but it still lay an inch thick along the ground. Of course the rest of the tunnels were still flooded. No hope there. So the room itself was sealed off. Sandbags at the only doorway with further waterproofing from rubber tarps. I'd since spent days trying to figure out where the last of the water in that one room was coming from, and had been so busy chasing leaks that I'd had to hire Marie to help with imaging. "Looks funny," I said as I leaned over her shoulder and looked at the latest picture. The wall appeared as an explosion of psychedelic colors, closer to a tie-dye t-shirt than the black obelisk it was in person. But it's a weird piece, very textured, and the paint itself is quite unique. I'm not surprised it behaves strangely under a camera's flash. "But look at it," she said. "I did," I replied while wandering off, unwilling to stare too long. "It's weird." "I don't like it," she said before quietly moving the tripod another few feet along. "Me neither," I snapped as I knelt down next to the broken pump. "So let's get on with it. I need all the help I can get." "All right," she tutted. Where's your partner in crime then? Alec's not been feeling well, I said. Ah, that's a shame. Always liked Al. Another flash. For a brief moment, my silhouette was painted on the wall opposite the mural. I could have sworn it was a different kind of black, as if my shadow had texture, brush strokes even. Before I had time to think about what I'd seen, Marie was suddenly standing by me. Still no luck with that pump? Driving me nuts, I said. Well, I want to set the X-ray up now. Won't take long, but we'll need to leave the room each time, or at least I will, since this is something I do daily. I thought about staying in that place alone. Fuck it, I'll join you, I said. Well, before we get going, I'm going to need help getting it into position. Sure thing, I said as I took her hand to get up. It was a big unit, designed to capture high-resolution images of what lay beneath paint and canvas, essential for seeing the early work of a painter. In the few years I'd spent in the archives of the National Gallery, I'd always enjoyed documenting the strange artifacts found beneath famous paintings. Sometimes you could even see a timeline of the artist's process, preliminary sketches, features removed, background details added late into the process. Most people don't realize there's more than one Mona Lisa lurking under all that paint. Okay, Marie said as we manhandled the machine onto the first little yellow marker she'd put on the ground. First of 4, I'll hit the timer, then we make our way to the corridor. It'll beep when it's done. Good to go? I nodded and she hit the button. We walked briskly to the exit and climbed over the barricade, pulling aside the plastic sheeting I'd draped over the doorway. Just as Marie was on the other side, we heard the beep telling us it was done. Then we were back inside where she removed the plate, put it into a waterproof duffel bag, and the process began again. Each time we moved it further down into the long room. Each time it took a little longer to get back to the exit. It was a pain in the ass, but necessary. Last one, Marie exclaimed when we finally hauled onto the 4th yellow marker. I'm actually curious to take a closer look at these pictures. You know, she added before pausing to look at the mural. It's horrible to look at, but you have to admire the skill that went into it. It's almost, well, familiar. Her words trailed off and she slowly tilted her head. I had to give her a nudge to remind her to press the button. She laughed, pressed it, and with that we were both marching back towards the exit. I quickly climbed over the barricade once more, turned to help Marie, but found myself staring at an empty doorway. The machine beeped to say it was done, and I poked my head through the tarp and looked around but couldn't see her. Confused, I climbed back in and scanned the room. Nothing. The machine was still there, humming away, but no sign of the woman who, until just a few seconds ago, was right behind me. "Marie?" I called out, but there was only the sound of dripping water. I was baffled. I couldn't understand where she had gone. She couldn't have gotten past me into the hallway. It just didn't make sense. But as the seconds turned to minutes, confusion was replaced with a chilling panic. "Marie?" I shouted again, and then again, and again. Each time, my voice got a little louder, and the repetitions grew closer together until I was pacing furiously, just screaming her name over and over again. My voice grew hoarse. I even stuck my head out into the corridor and cried out, but there was never any response. I checked every inch of that place, and when I didn't find her, I checked every inch again. Part of me started to visualize her eventual return, to hope for it. Started to imagine that moment of relief, the sight of her appearing at a doorway before explaining where she'd gone. I held on to that fantasy so hard that at times it felt as if I was alive in 2 worlds at once. One where Marie and I were laughing about a slight misunderstanding, and another where a woman could disappear into thin air. Surely the latter isn't reality, I thought to myself as I shouted over and over. This one has to be the dream. But if it was a dream, I wasn't waking up, and eventually I accepted that I had to go get help. I didn't even grab my things before stepping out into the corridor. I was in a rush, desperate to get this nightmare over with, to get help and to find Marie somewhere safe and sound, but I only made it a few feet when I heard her voice call out to me from behind. "Mike, I don't feel so good. Am I dreaming?" She was leaning on the doorway I'd just left, eyes sunken and cheeks sallow. Even her hair looked thinner. She looked like a woman who'd just spent a week on a desert island. "Jesus Christ," I cried before running over and grabbing her. She was close to collapse, wobbling back and forth and clutching the door just to stay standing. "Where the fuck did you go?" "It's so dark in here, I want to go home," she said in a quiet drone, like a child that had just been pulled out of a car crash. All right, I said. What is that?" She was holding something in her hands. It was one of the plates from the X-ray machine. She didn't even register me taking it from her. Down in the dark, it didn't look like much, and being in a hurry, I simply tucked it under one arm and helped her over the barricade and into the water. Everything that followed was a rushed blur. I took her into the church, sat her on a pew, and called for an ambulance. Paramedics quickly arrived and rushed her off, asking a few questions here and there about what I think might have happened. I had no real answers to speak of, but when I mentioned that she didn't have her respirator on her, they all seemed to take it as a given that she had carbon monoxide poisoning. That was the official diagnosis for Alec, and I recognized a few of the paramedics from when I'd called them out for him, so they must have connected the dots. But CO poisoning didn't explain why she looked so thin and, I don't know, broken. She looked worse than awful. Seeing in her that state had terrified me. At least she's in safe hands, I told myself as I watched the ambulance doors close. I decided it was time to call it a day and went to grab some of the things I'd left on a nearby bench when I saw the slide Marie had been holding. The light was a little better in the church, especially since it was midday, and that broken roof filled the place with rays of amber light. I took the X-ray and held the black plate up, squinting to see what it showed. It looked like a hurricane of swirls and spiraling bone-white shapes, a confusing mess of strange distortions that reminded me distantly of the background of Van Gogh's Starry Night. Only there in the middle of all those swirling, roiling lines and growths was a woman. Marie, in fact. I was sure of it, and she had both hands clutched to the side of her head like she was screaming for her life. "You saw it." The old man who'd answered the door was practically skeletal, but he wasn't infirm. He glared at me with twitchy anticipation of my answer. He seemed ready to explode. "You saw the mural?" "Yes. When my secretary got your phone call, I was ready to dismiss you entirely." Slowly, he looked me up and down like a piece of meat. "You look intact." "Ma." I tried speaking, but something about the old man's intense stare caught me off guard. Noticing this, he pulled the door open and gestured inside his luxurious apartment with one arm. "Come in," he cried. "I had my staff confirm you really have done work in the church. I am fascinated by what you might have seen." "I was told you bought Mr. Halswell's paintings," I said as he ushered me into a room decorated with gleaming hardwood furniture and beautiful red velvet wallpaper. "A collection at an auction," I stammered. "You spent quite a lot of money on them." "Yes," he replied while sitting opposite me. "Halswell was touched, you know. Spent his life trying to exorcise the things he saw." Right," I stammered. "I just wanted to know if you had any information on the mural in the church." "My boy, you've actually seen it, which makes you far more of an expert than I am." He spoke like he was giving me the greatest compliment. I never had the nerve to go look. I love my esoteric hobby as much as anyone, but I prefer the occult, where it is unlikely to do me harm. "Well, I'm just concerned. I had 2 friends collapse in there, and one of them, well, I can't rightly explain it, but she went missing for a while. The church aren't a lot of help, but they told me to speak to you if I wanted some information about the artist." "Oh, the church has no real record of that place, not properly anyway." "What is it?" I asked, growing tired and wanting to cut to the chase. "What did George Halswell paint? I've had 2 colleagues pass out down there, and now one of them isn't answering my calls. Please, I need answers." "George didn't paint anything," he said with a shrug. "He was sent down as a handyman and found it hidden behind crates of old rubbish. Whatever he saw, he felt compelled to paint over it. An attempt at censorship. He wanted to hide it away. That's why he was charged with vandalism by the old priest who is long since dead. But George's efforts were in vain. He could not unsee what he'd seen, and it would stick with him forever." "I don't understand. The mural is—" He leaned forward and grinned. I could tell he'd been hoping for this. Yes, he whispered. "Tell me about it." "It's not just tar on a wall," I said. "It's more. It has a kind of depth. There are brushstrokes all over. Thousands, if not millions. They don't look like they form a pattern, but they do. It sits behind your eyes and burns the sinuses. It's an impression of something. The darkness inside a coffin. It looks featureless, but it isn't. Sometimes it's as if it crawls." "Fascinating. Well, the brushstrokes don't surprise me, he said while sitting back with a satisfied grin. George used his hands, but whatever he tried to hide, it didn't just go away because he painted over it. He didn't erase anything, merely changed it, gave it a different face to wear. But if he didn't make it, who did? He shrugged. Who knows? Those tunnels are so extensive because there were multiple archaeological dig sites held there throughout the 19th century. They found mosaics dated to the Romans' first arrival in Britain, along with pots and clay that were even older. Some say the church was built atop it to hide the darkness below, but that was too long ago for anyone to remember. When I called the Archbishop to check if they'd really sent you down there, they seemed under the misconception George had created the mural from scratch, but the painting on that wall predates us all. His shoulders sagged and a look of defeat took over him as he added, I wish I had the courage to see it. I was afraid. So often the truth can be frightening. When I heard Holswell's daughter was auctioning off some of his later works, I thought maybe this could be a chance to catch a glimpse of it, a way of seeing what George Holswell saw as retold by him through new artistic expression. I sighed. This visit hadn't really told me a great deal so far. Sensing my disappointment, the old man smiled. Would you like to see them? His paintings? Suddenly, he was the spry and lively person who'd opened the door to me just a short while ago. He sprang to his feet and clapped happily. Come, 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 he said in a frantic tone. Come, there's something special. Whatever George saw down there, it really did a number on him. He wasn't taking no for an answer. He even reached out and grabbed my hand, pulling me along like an excited child until we arrived at a small room he'd decorated as a gallery. The walls densely packed with paintings and prints worth millions, some of which I recognized as worth millions, but he strolled past them like they meant nothing. When he shoved me eagerly in front of his newest collection, I understood why. Holswell's paintings were not pure black, spiritual relatives of the mural, but with just enough light to see things beyond. They were detailed and beautiful, at least in the artistic principles used to make them, the forms and anatomy, the use of color and space. But it was the contents that gripped me and made me nauseous. There were 7, all showing an array of people in various forms of torture and deprivation, flaying, amputation, drowning, bright white eyes staring at me from a wretched abyss. But it was 2 of them in particular that had left me feeling like my heart was about to fall out through my stomach. They showed Marie and Alec, thin and starved, weeping and broken, screaming into the emptiness as some unseen force dragged them into icy black water. It shouldn't be possible. George Holswell had died 16 years prior. There was no way he could have painted my friends, but there was no mistaking the people in those images. Christ, it even showed Alec's tattoo. Whatever was buried down there and found by George, the old man said as he savored the shock and terror on my face, is an open invitation to something no one wants to meet. I would say best of luck to you and your colleagues, but there's no point. You're already done for. Al, come on, let me in. I banged on the door for the 10th time without reply. Last time I'd seen Alec was when I'd driven him home from the hospital after he collapsed, and that had been 3 weeks ago. I'd just assumed he'd gone to stay with his parents, like he told me he was going to do. But after I saw those paintings, I had a terrible feeling that something bad had happened to him. I called his parents, hoping he'd be there, but they told me they hadn't heard from him. Didn't even realize anything bad had happened. Half-hour later and I was outside his door doing everything I could to reach him. Come on, I shouted before knocking again. Marie's missing. Is she with you? Please, Al, tell me you're both okay. Anxious and scared for my friend, I put my ear to the door, hoping I might hear him approaching. There were only faint sounds of movement, irregular, the slightest suggestion of somebody talking. Al, I cried, Al, please open up. Something loud struck the door and made me jump, and that sinking feeling in my chest grew worse. He was alive, at least, but that didn't mean he was okay. Even if it meant pissing him off, I was going to have to get in there and check on him. Thankfully, I had a spare key from a long time ago and used it to pop the door open just an inch or two and peer inside. But there was only darkness. Al! I cried through the small opening and immediately regretted it. Something about the smell of the place. Mildew and damp. It made my skin crawl, and the carpet was soggy like there'd been a leak no one had bothered to fix. It reminded me of the church basement. Not just the water or the smell, but the shadows. The distant sight of doorways leading into empty spaces wreathed in darkness, I didn't want to announce my presence in that place, but I had to let Alec know I was entering his home. "Alec, it's Mike. Are you in?" There was a muffled bump way off in the back, so I pushed the door open the rest of the way before propping it in place with a nearby extinguisher. The light that streamed in was feeble, but it offered me slight comfort. Unfortunately, I only took a few steps before the door slammed shut, and I was left in total darkness, desperate. I grabbed my torch and turned it on, and what I saw nearly made me drop it again. There was someone staring at me from a doorway at the far end of the hall. Sunken eyes and pale skin, hair thinning so badly I could see the scalp, inflamed and raw, and that expression, a dull but hateful glare, the drooling gaze of a lobotomized killer. I didn't even recognize it as Alec at first. It took a few seconds of being gripped with terror before I realized it was my old friend leering at me from a darkened room. Alec?" I stuttered. "Are you okay?" He said nothing. He simply stepped backward and seemed to dissolve into the very shadows. I summoned what little bravery I had left and took a few careful steps towards the doorway where he'd been, but I still couldn't see anything. Only when I stood so close that I had one hand on the jamb did I manage to get a good look inside. Alec was crouched in the corner near some broken furniture, naked and pale, spine jutting out from between distended shoulder blades like a starved survivor. He was muttering quietly to himself, the same phrase again and again. I couldn't be certain, but it sounded like he was saying it's so dark in here. I wanted to call out to him, but the words were caught in my throat when I saw his blackened fingertips and the buckets of empty paint. He had remade the mural, or perhaps just some version of it, a dark and confusing mess of thick, glassy obsidian brushstrokes that covered an entire wall. His TV lay smashed on the floor where he'd pulled it down, his sofa pulled out, the coffee table tossed aside. It was like he'd been in a mad rush to get at the wall. Now everything in that place was broken, taken to pieces. Worse even, a lot of it was rotten, turning to filth and mold. It was as if the church basement was crawling out of that black wall, musty air and stagnant water seeping through the waxy paint to taint everything it touched. "Al," I said, unable to hide the tremor in my voice, "we need to get out of here now." He looked back at me with teary, desperate eyes. He says if you want us back, you know where to look. With alarming speed, Al jumped upright and ran towards the wall where he disappeared into the paint like a rock falling into water. I thumped down into the water with a splash and immediately scanned the basement. Black water rippled away into the distance as my chalky light swept over old boxes and broken shelves. I tried everything to hold on to that sense of urgency and bravado that had compelled me to come rushing over to the church, but in the face of the aching dark that lingered at the edge of my torchlight, I could already feel it slipping away. I knew I had to go marching into those shadows, deep into the tunnel at the far end of the room that would take me to the mural. I had to save my friends. Every time I thought about leaving them to their fate, I remembered that painting, the look on their faces, agony and torture written in such despairing eyes. If there was even a chance of reaching them, I had to try. And given Al's words to me in that apartment, there really was no doubt about where to look. Each step was a struggle. The sound of water drove my paranoia to new heights as I kept stopping, expecting to hear the footsteps of some unseen pursuer, or perhaps something up ahead. But it wasn't until I reached the room with the piano that I finally heard the sound of someone else down there with me. Music. I stopped, not quite sure whether I could trust my senses. Was I really hearing it? Or was my terrified mind just conjuring the worst-case scenario? But soon enough the background noise died down, and clear as day I could hear a dreadful song, a strange, discordant tone, weak and off-key, played with only the vague memory of real musical talent. Shaking with terror, I dipped my light in a desperate bid to make myself less visible and approached the doorway. Marie was sitting there waiting for me. I recognized her as my friend, but this was not the woman I knew. She had aged decades in the time since I'd last seen her, and grown so thin she didn't even look human anymore. And her eyes, beady and black, nestled above a manic and sadistic grin that was anything but joyful. "He's taking his time with you," she said in a lilting sing-song before rising to face me, her broken, sagging body on full display with thick, knotted scars. This was not the woman I'd put in that ambulance. Maybe it was her after she'd survived a nuclear war, but no, it simply wasn't possible that she could have changed so radically in so little time. But that was her face, twisted with hate and a kind of hunger, but still her face. She looked ready to lunge at me, the tense anticipation of her coming, and I really didn't like the thought of those bitten yellow nails scratching at my face and eyes. But instead of leaping, she simply giggled and slid quietly into the water, disappearing beneath the black surface. I contemplated leaving and turned to look at the way I came, but some 20 meters away my light caught a glimpse of Marie's frightening face staring at me. I jumped, shocked at how she'd managed to slip past me and all the way over there without me noticing. And now she waited, daring me to try and leave. I wanted to march over there, but Jesus, the look on her face. I decided I had no choice but to move onwards to the mural. Maybe Alec would have come to his senses and could help me. A slim hope, but that was all I had to steel myself. So I walked slowly to the final doorway and stepped over the sandbags and into the room with the mural. Everything was where we'd left it weeks before, even the old X-ray machine on its tripod. Slowly, a kind of darkness seeped into my thoughts, and the air grew dense and fluid, filling me up like I was drowning in filth. I tried to keep my mind in order and work out the next course of action, but it was useless. I fell to my knees and started to heave, but the harder I fought for breath, the worse it became. Minutes stretched on as the edges of my vision pulsed red and black, and I realized it was as if I was drowning but could not die. And then a horrible notion started to burn its way into my mind. Slowly, it came to me as a powerful truth that all the time I'd spent outside that room was a lie, just a kind of dream. All the daylight I'd since seen, the mornings waking in my own bed, the sight of London's skyline, and the sound of a world made of bright and colourful things. Those memories were just thin plastic over a far deeper truth. That room, Alec's collapse, Marie's disappearance, they were the only real things I'd experienced, and the cold and damp and dark were all that remained to me. There was no outside world. All of that was a dream, his dream. The only thing that really existed was the ocean on the other side of that wall, and everything else was dreamt up by something that lay in its depths. I nearly collapsed beneath the weight of these thoughts. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment I tried to recall from my old life was like passing a kidney stone. And then I heard it. A trickle. Looking towards the wall, I saw water seeping out of the paint like sweat from skin. Slowly at first, but then it grew and grew until the trickles turned to a steady pouring, leaks springing in a dam that held back waters from another world. Eventually it gave. All at once, a great and terrifying torrent of black water spewed from the painting. It did not last long, a few seconds at most, but it was enough to quite suddenly fill the room with another foot of water. And once the foam and crashing waves dispelled, I saw him, Alec, kneeling in front of the mural. "It's your turn in the dark now," he groaned, and all thoughts of rescue fled my mind as I looked at him. What had I even been thinking going there? What was I going to do against that? You couldn't fight it, couldn't stab it or kill it, and Alec's words had chilled me to the bone. God, no, I thought. No, I'm not going in there. "He wants one of us back in there, and it's only fair it ain't me," Alec cried as he rose to his full height. Whatever he'd been through, he was in a far worse state than Marie. He wasn't just starved, he was falling apart. His torso covered in great weeping lesions so large and deep that you could see exposed muscle and bone beneath. It was as if he had been coughed up out of some giant's belly, half digested and barely alive. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." "We had our turns," he screamed suddenly. "We went in. It's your turn now." I ran. I launched myself over the barricade and fled screaming down the tunnel. I moved through the water like I never had before. I wasted no time looking behind me, didn't even waste energy on thoughts of what was happening. There was only the need to drive one leg forward through the water, like a piston in an engine. The burning in my muscles didn't matter. The thunder of my beating heart, so wild and furious it felt like I might just collapse and die at any second, didn't matter. None of it mattered. All that existed to me in those desperate few minutes of flight was the memory of the world above. Sunlight, birds, smiling strangers and delicious food, my home and my bed, a world where things made sense. I was crying when I finally reached the basement and saw the stairs leading up into the light. My heart quickened as I climbed up them on all fours, and my hand reached out for the final one when the world exploded. pain. Red. Something like lightning seemed to shoot out of my mouth, spreading across my face in terrible pulses of agony. I had slipped and smashed my face onto the final stone step, catching the very edge on my bottom teeth, shattering them into shards that now floated freely in my mouth. But that wasn't what brought me out of the shock. No, what brought me back into awareness was the feeling of cold water rising over my shoulders and a hand clamping onto my ankle with almost machine-like strength. Alec had caught me at the final moment and was now dragging my floating body back towards the darkness. I wasted no time. I immediately thrashed and struggled to find my way back onto my feet as he turned and pummeled me with ape-like blows. "It's your turn," he bellowed. "We spent our time in the dark." In the frantic struggle, I saw Marie crouched in the corner and sobbing. "We're all his anyway," she whined like a petulant child. "We all have to take our turn. One way or another, he has us." She launched herself towards me, and I finally lost all desire to help my friends. I hit her as hard as I could, one solid blow in the face. That scrawny little neck whipped back and she disappeared beneath the waves. Jesus Christ, I still don't know if I killed her. I only know that from that moment on it was just Alec trying to drag me back towards the mural. He'd always been bigger and stronger than me, and while he was a bone-thin ghost of his former self, he still held onto me with a steel grip, using one hand while he rained terrible blows down on my head with the other. Bloody and confused, I ended up using one hand to cover my face while the other groped desperately for anything I could use. Eventually, I found something. Cold and wet and slick, an old piece of wood. I swung it as hard as I could and it broke across his face like rotten mulch. He stopped and grinned. It hadn't even fazed him, but where the old piece of wood had broken, I now clutched a jagged collection of splinters, gritting my teeth and tapping into what little reserves of anger I had left. I reached forward and drove the few inches of broken wood into the largest open wound in his gut. This time he didn't grin. He screamed and let go of me, staring in horror at the filthy wood jutting out of his flesh. I wasted not 1 second more waiting for him to recover. I ran up the stairs, up into the open light of the church, and slammed the trapdoor shut with a heavy, final thud. Alec and Marie were found unresponsive in their homes just a few weeks later. Not much was made of the painting on Alec's wall, nor the one Marie had apparently made herself. The police questioned me briefly, but seemed to ask a lot of questions about drugs. I think, based on the state of their homes, the police thought Marie and Alec had been addicts. Flooding, mold, decay. I did ask the police to destroy the murals they had made in their homes, but they told me it'd be down to the landlord to deal with repairs, although they said that both apartments would likely have to be gutted and rebuilt from scratch. Alec and Marie are both still in hospital to this day, comatose. It was years before I summoned the strength to visit them, and even then I never went further than the door to Alec's room. I merely lingered there and watched him for a moment, hoping that I might convince myself everything that had happened was just some kind of sick dream. Hopes that were dashed when Alec briefly came awake and turned to me. "It's your turn in his belly," he said. "This life or the next, you're going there." He grinned before collapsing back into unconsciousness, and I left and never returned. Since then, I've worked a number of jobs, the sole requirement being I never ever want to work on another painting again. Retail, construction, factories, anything, so long as I don't have to pick up a brush or look at one's work. Alec's words in the hospital have frightened me so deeply that I doubt the fear will ever fade. Each night I dream I'm back in that basement. Others, I am in a timeless void and something terrible is looming towards me. A mouth bigger than most football stadiums, ringed with teeth several stories high. But the worst are the ones where I am trapped, suffocating, in total darkness as some invisible fluid burns my skin. But no matter how much I scream or cry, I can't claw my way to freedom. Instead, the more I thrash, the more those ribbed, mucus-covered walls seem to compress around me until I can hardly breathe. These dreams are growing more frequent, and recently I have begun to worry that Alec and Marie were right. It is my turn in the dark. It has always been my turn. This life or the next, it's where I'm going. Or maybe I'm just going mad! After all, I woke up this morning to paint all over my hands, and the beginnings of something strange daubed in filthy finger streaks upon my wall. The nightmare started over a month ago when I heard my husband mumble, He's standing in the garden. He's looking in the window. It must have been 2 in the morning. I sighed and rubbed my eyes. You could set your watch by him. At that time, my sleep had been disturbed regularly by Daryl's sleepwalking and sleep-talking, and sometimes sleep-yelling. He'd never done anything like that before. It had just started out of the blue about 3 days prior to that night. That night, when he was whispering, mumbling while he dreamt. His voice was low and hushed. He's trying to get inside. I couldn't help but look over at the curtained windows. I imagined that if I pulled the curtains aside, I'd see a ghostly hand pressed up on the window pane. The little hairs on my neck stood on end. I shook my husband awake. He jolted like he'd just tripped over something and his eyes shot open. He breathed heavily but quickly came to. Was I talking again? He asked out of breath. Sweat beaded his forehead. Yeah, it just keeps getting creepier. My eyes were wide. He looked over at me, his face tired. Was it the guy in the garden? I nodded. Yeah, you said he was trying to look through the windows. He rubbed his eyes and replied, I can't remember really. It's so vivid while I'm asleep, but as soon as I'm awake, it just slips away. I rubbed his arm, trying to comfort him. Let's try and get back to bed. We need to pick up Jacob early. He nodded and got out of bed to fetch some water and a melatonin pill. I drank the rest of some cold chamomile tea I'd not finished the night before. Then we went back to bed. It was about 3 in the morning when we fell back to sleep. At 7 o'clock the next morning, my alarm rang loud and shrill. I kept my eyes closed as I fumbled for it and hit the snooze button. By 7:30 we were up and on our way to the train station. Jacob was waiting for us with a large suitcase and an old worn backpack. Jacob was our nephew. He was a scrawny guy with dark brown hair and bright green eyes. Jacob had just started his final year at university and was studying zoology. He was considering starting veterinary school after his bachelor's degree was done and was visiting schools around the country. Daryl and I lived near a large veterinary hospital and school, so Jacob had come by to see if it was any good. He knew we were in the area, and so he'd decided to stay with us in the meantime. His eyes were dark and exhausted as we pulled up. How was the train? I asked as he climbed into the back seat. Daryl loaded Jacob's suitcase into the trunk and got back into the driver's seat. Delayed and uncomfortable. I was just managing to get some sleep right as I arrived. Figures, Jacob said, his voice irritable and feeble. Well, you can get plenty of rest at the house. It's quiet at the moment with everyone away for the holidays. The family of 4 next door is in Ecuador. We continued to chat as Daryl drove us home. Jacob mentioned he was excited to check out the school and would leave to take a tour the next day. I asked Daryl to drive him, but Jacob said he'd rather take the bus so he could get to know the area better. The day after that was Sunday, so we slept in and had breakfast food for lunch. After that, Jacob left for the bus stop. Daryl and I did some chores and then we sat down to read. The air was peaceful and quiet. I remember it was the last time I had felt relaxed, felt normal and comfortable in my own home. The day had been warm and bright and sunbeams illuminated small motes of dust in the air. Pretty soon Daryl and I both fell asleep on the couch, leaning against one another. Suddenly there was a loud shout and I sat up, my eyes wide and suddenly very awake. Daryl was sitting up straight, his chest heaving heavily with breath. That was a bad one, he panted. What happened? Why did you shout? I asked, my hand on my chest. I was dreaming. About that guy again. Except he wasn't alone this time. This time he was with a woman. They were standing just outside. He turned to look at the window. They were throwing rock. Out of nowhere there was the deafening shatter of glass. I yelled. Daryl leapt to his feet in fright. I glanced down at the floor. Among a pile of broken glass lay a single rock. It was small, dark and smooth as glass. As soon as I looked at it, I felt a cold trail of goose flesh run down my neck and arms. There was something so unnatural about that rock. It looked artificially polished. Daryl and I ran to the window, carefully avoiding the shards. There was nothing outside save my front yard. My petunias and crane lilies waved gently in the breeze. No one was standing there. The air was thick with silence. All the neighbors were still away on holiday. Daryl and I looked at one another, our eyes searching each other's expressions for some kind of explanation. I was hoping Daryl would declare himself the mastermind of this terrifying practical joke, but no confessions came. "Must be kids playing a prank," he said as he cleaned the glass and tossed the stone into the yard. But his face was still white and his hands trembled. He wasn't quite convinced. Later that same evening, Jacob returned from his sightseeing and was thrilled. We decided not to tell Jacob about what had happened, and Daryl, being a very proficient engineer, had already replaced the window pane that afternoon. Jacob couldn't stop going on about the facilities and the local cafes. We were happy for him as we ordered pizza and watched some silly rom-coms. We all went to bed at around midnight. As I lay in bed and turned off my light, I couldn't help but look over at the curtained windows momentarily. The curtains hung ruby red and still as stone. Was there someone standing outside? I shivered as I rolled over in bed and cuddled up close to my husband. I was glad to have my back to the window. I felt like I'd just closed my eyes when I was disturbed. I had turned over while half asleep and found myself suddenly alone in bed. It's always disconcerting to find yourself unexpectedly alone in the middle of the night. At first, my face still buried in a pillow, I figured Daryl was on the toilet. As I rolled over and opened my eyes, I noticed a figure standing at the foot of our bed. It was Daryl. I jumped from fright and yelped. "My God, Daryl, you frightened me," I said as I clutched my chest and breathed hard. "What are you doing standing there?" I asked. Daryl did not stir. His back still faced me. He seemed to be staring at the curtains in front of him. Then he spoke, and it filled me with terror. "They're outside. They're calling," he said, his voice flat and vacant. He was sleep-talking again, and now he was sleepwalking. I felt my stomach fill with boiling lead. "Come back to bed," I said shakily as I slowly sat up. Something wasn't right. "They're outside. They're coming." His voice sounded slurred, like he'd been drinking. Daryl took a few quick steps toward the window. I felt my heart skip a beat. I ripped the duvet off my legs, but as my feet touched the floor, there was a tremendous smash. I screamed as the window to my right shattered into 1,000 pieces. The sudden commotion made me lose my balance and I fell on the ground hard. I felt a frigid gust howl through the broken window. "What?" I didn't get a chance to finish speaking before the window in front of Daryl exploded too. The wind that blasted through was so strong and cold it forced my eyes closed. My teeth began to chatter. How was it suddenly so cold? Daryl? The wind died down and I opened my eyes. Daryl was gone. My mind felt empty. My limbs were heavy. Confusion washed over me. "Daryl," I said again. The wind had vanished, and the chill in the air had retreated completely. I slowly stood. My eyes searched the ground for signs of another rock, but there was nothing. I walked up to the closest smashed window. When I looked outside, all I saw was my garden shrouded in darkness. The half-moon was obscured by wispy clouds. "What?" I whispered, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I suddenly heard a hoarse whisper behind me. "Auntie Valerie, what's going on?" I spun around to see the dark silhouette of Jacob standing in my bedroom doorway. I could just make out the look of worry on his face. "I'm not sure. Your uncle is missing. I'm not sure what happened. The windows, they broke. I think I need to call the police." I hurried over to my phone and called 911. Within 15 minutes, 2 exhausted-looking police officers arrived and took my statement. I trembled as I spoke. I told them everything. I told them about my husband's dreams. I told them about the smashed window from the afternoon, and I also showed them the mess in my bedroom. They were sympathetic and offered to drive me to the hospital for a checkup. I declined. I just needed rest. They told me not to worry, that my husband probably hadn't gotten far, that he must have broken the windows in his sleep. When I tried to tell them there was no way my husband broke the windows, one of the cops said, "Look, people can do weird and out-of-character things while sleepwalking. We once had to go fetch some teenage kid from some park in the middle of the night. He was up some tree and refused to climb down. He'd done it all in his sleep." They said they'd look around the area and let me know if they found him. Jacob gave a statement too, but he had been asleep. After he heard the window smash, he'd gone through to investigate. A few minutes after the police left, I found myself sitting on my couch with a cup of cocoa clutched in my still shaking hands. Jacob sat near me and tried to comfort me. He got me a blanket. I was still unable to comprehend what had happened. My eyes stared into space, unblinking. Where had Daryl gone? Who were those people? I felt a lump of dread lodge itself in my stomach. What the hell had happened? A week went by. The police still had no information. Jacob postponed going home to help look after me. He was really such a sweet kid. It was late in the afternoon and I was preparing lunch. Suddenly, Jacob walked into the kitchen. "Ah, Auntie Valerie, can I talk with you?" I stopped dicing onions and looked up at him. His expression was guilty. He was awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck with his hand. "Yes, what's up?" I said curiously, putting down the knife. He looked embarrassed. His eyes couldn't meet mine. I kind of lied. To the police. And you, about what happened that night, last week, when it happened. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My heart fluttered. What do you mean?" I said. He paused. It seemed to last forever. The room felt so silent I could hear my heart thump loudly in my chest. Jacob still couldn't meet my gaze as he replied, "I forgot to close my curtains that night, and something must have disturbed me in my sleep, because I woke up in the middle of the night before the windows smashed. When I sat up in bed, I froze. I saw people standing outside, at least a dozen people. I couldn't see their faces, just dark shapes, their outlines. They were all in the garden. I didn't know what to do. Then suddenly I heard the window smash and I got distracted. I looked away from my window for a second, and when I looked back..." He paused. Tears were now forming in his eyes. "I saw Uncle Daryl. He was standing right at my window. He was staring in at me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew it was him." Slowly he turned around and walked away. As I blinked, he vanished. That's when I got out of bed and came out to see you. I was convinced I had dreamt the whole thing. I mean, how could that be possible? I was scared the cops, that you, would think I was crazy. But now I don't think it was just my imagination. I've seen them again. Not in my dreams. I mean, I saw them outside my window. I saw them last night. I don't know what's happening. I think I should go home, but I don't want to abandon you." He was crying now. His voice was full of fear. I was shaking. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Don't worry, my boy. Everything's going to be fine. I'm sure it was just a dream. I mean, I didn't actually see anyone else myself. The police are probably right. They'll find your uncle." I gave him a big hug. "Maybe it would be a good idea for you to go home. You must miss your own bed. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. And after everything that's happened, you should go home. I'm sure your parents are anxious to see you. Let's get you sorted." Within an hour, Jacob was packed, and I drove him to the train station. We didn't speak much on the way there, and when we said goodbye, I gave him an extra tight hug. I'd never admit it to him, but I was dreading going back home alone, back to that same bed. The bedroom windows had been repaired, but I still felt a cold wind whenever I looked at them. It was 2 o'clock the next morning when my phone started ringing. Groggily, I reached over to my bedside table. I answered, my voice croaky from sleep. "Yes?" I said, sitting up. I switched on my light. "They were on the train." I heard a flat monotone voice answer. A chill rippled down my spine. "Jacob," I said softly. "They were on the train. They found me." All traces of sleep vanished from my voice. "Jacob, this isn't funny," I said angrily. I was terrified at that moment. There was a slight pause before he continued. "They're outside your house too. They're outside. They want to come inside." What the hell do they want, Jacob? Are you okay?" Suddenly the phone went dead. I just sat in bed. My nerves were burning with fear. I didn't get any sleep that night. I wasn't surprised when I got a call from my sister a few hours later. Jacob had never got home. I told her and the police I'd dropped him off, and the security footage at the train station confirmed my story. It even showed him board the train at 6:30 that evening. He'd taken an overnight train. But the security footage from his destination showed no trace of him. Just like Daryl, he had vanished. I also hadn't told anyone about Jacob's phone call, and the police never brought it up. Had it ever happened? I decided not to tell my sister anything more than what I'd told the police. I felt a numbness in my brain and body that refused to abate. I hardly had the motivation to do anything except eat and drink for days after that. I haven't been able to leave my house for 2 weeks now. I never open the curtains anymore. Every night I sit in my living room, the lights on, and every night since Jacob disappeared, I've heard a gentle tapping, a tapping on my living room windows. Last night I heard their voices for the first time. I heard Daryl and Jacob. They were both calling me, stretching out the vowels in my name as they spoke. Valerie, Valerie, they want to come in, Valerie, they just want to talk. It's not so bad, Valerie. I felt completely helpless. The police were useless, of course. Whenever I called them and they showed up, the things outside would vanish. They now told me to stop bothering them, or they'd charge me with wasting police time. And it seems that running away wasn't really an option. The sun is beginning to set, and I find myself sitting once again in my living room. I've boarded up all my windows and sit on my sofa clutching a golf club in my hands. Maybe I can't stop them from getting inside, but I'd be damned if I wasn't going to put up a fight. I've also left myself a secret way out just in case, but won't write that down here. I don't want them to find it out. The sun is now completely gone. I can hear the tapping on my window. It is louder than before. My grip on the golf club tightens. The tapping has now turned into full-on knocking. Someone was banging their fists hard on the boarded windows. I've decided to write this all down so that when I suddenly disappear, people may be able to figure out what happened here. Maybe they can find Daryl or Jacob, or me, but I figure it's likely no one will ever see me again. Perhaps it won't be so bad. At least I will be with Daryl and Jacob again soon. These stories are more than just nightmares. They're real experiences shared by people who never expected to encounter something so disturbing. What's scarier, the fact that they lived to tell the tale, or that it could happen to any of us? As the final echoes of these stories fade, and the last words linger in the stillness of the night, one question remains. What is it about fear that captivates us so deeply? Is it the thrill of the unknown, the unsettling realization that the world is far darker and stranger than we dare to admit? Or perhaps it's because deep down, we know that these stories, no matter how fantastical, carry some sliver of truth. Maybe that creaking floorboard, that flicker of movement in the corner of your eye, or that whisper you swear you heard late at night, isn't just a product of your imagination after all. It's funny, isn't it? How we find ourselves drawn to the very things that frighten us, like moths to a flame, knowing full well that we may never be the same after we hear them. Each story opens a door, a gateway to a world where the boundaries of reality blur, where what we know and what we fear collide. But be careful, because once you step through that door, there's no telling what might follow you back. Fear doesn't just leave when the story ends. Oh no. It lingers, hiding in the corners of your mind, waiting for that perfect moment. Maybe tonight, when the lights are out and you're tucked safely into your bed, the shadows will seem just a little too deep, a little too alive. Maybe you'll hear a sound, just a faint creak, or the softest of whispers. You'll tell yourself it's nothing, that your mind is just playing tricks on you. But remember, these stories come from somewhere, inspired by the very things we dread but rarely speak of. You see, it's not just the dark we fear, it's what could be hiding within it. The unseen things that watch us, that wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. And maybe, just maybe, they've been waiting for someone like you. So if you enjoyed these terrifying tales, and you're brave enough to dive even deeper into the unknown, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Click the notification bell so you're always the first to hear when we unlock the door to new stories, new fears, each tale more spine-chilling than the last, each one bringing you a step closer to the things that lurk in the places where nightmares live. And remember, the more you listen, the more you invite those fears in. But that's what you came here for, isn't it? To experience the terror, to feel that rush, to let your imagination run wild. Just remember, sometimes the things we imagine have a way of creeping into reality when we least expect it. So take one last look around the room. Make sure everything is as it should be. Is the door locked? Are the windows closed? Perhaps you'll double check before you turn off the lights tonight. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll leave them on. Because who knows what might be watching, waiting for the moment when darkness finally falls. Thank you for joining us on this eerie journey. There are always more stories waiting to be told. Stories of things we can't explain. Things that defy logic and reason. Things that make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. With that said, thank you for watching. Stay safe. And until next time, keep the lights on. You never know what might be waiting in the dark.